I want to thank the Planning Committee for inviting me to be here, and I think I have Dr. Tony Forsheet to thank for that invitation. He heard me speak at Lincoln Memorial a few weeks back, and what I'm going to bring you is probably some thoughts that nobody in this room's really ever had before. They might be a little outside your box of thinking, and I hope that that'll be refreshing. At lunch, I was joking with somebody at the table, and we were talking about using Slido. I said, well, maybe for your talk, Cheryl, we'll have them use Slido and give you a thumbs up or a thumb down as to whether we should pull you off the podium or not. So let's everybody wake up. Okay, so this is a session on what's new in efforts to provide information. I'm looking forward to hearing from Dr. Petra because I'm going to bring just a tiny bit of an international and kind of a 70,000-foot view from the One Health perspective. First of all, I'll just ask, how many of you in the room knew about One Health before you got involved with NIAA? Okay, how many of you, those hands down, how many of you there's One Health a relatively new concept to? Okay, so most people in the room have some idea what we're talking about. So I'm not going to go into a long definition. You've heard us had mentioned now for 2 days. One Health is just a concept of us trying to get out of our silos and interact with each other because we don't usually have those opportunities in our current systems. One Health Day is a day that we celebrate that was created a couple of years ago by the One Health Commission and the One Health Platform and the One Health Initiative, a partnership in the One Health space to celebrate and recognize One Health. The top map that you see there, the 2016 one was the first year we held it. We were blown away by the number of people and organizations around the world who took this as an opportunity to educate about some One Health issue or about One Health in their region. So I would just hope that you'll get the global perspective of this concept and how it's really in my mind, taking root a lot better, more deeply in some of the countries around the world, better than the United States, because we don't have to worry about a lot of the things that other countries have to worry about. We live in a pretty protected environment, actually. So the one on the bottom is 2018. We still have events coming in. It's pretty exciting. So just make you aware, maybe you and your organization would like to do an event next year. I hope that eventually you'll all agree with me that I think One Health thinking and acting and believing in value sets will be a true ray of hope for us for the future, because I think truly we're on an unsustainable course of staying in our silos, and I'm very heartened to hear the discussions at this meeting. So this is not a talk about One Health. I have an hour-long talk about One Health that I would love to share with you, but this is a talk about antibiotics. I just want to give you a real quick smattering of some of the many faces of One Health. Sometimes I'm actually attacked. I've had people say to me, well, One Health is about everything, therefore it's about nothing. And that couldn't be further from the truth. The point is, there are so many arenas that we need this interaction across professions that we're not getting right now. There's so many arenas that it just looks like One Health is about everything. So please, if you think that that's the case, let's talk, because I really want you to understand that it's all the way from conversations about animals being sentinels for things that we're exposed to in our environment to zoonotic diseases, which has been a major driving force for One Health. But antimicrobial resistance falls smackly in that area. Excuse me. So from an international perspective, how many of you were aware that there was commissioned by the United Kingdom Prime Minister back in 2014 a review on antimicrobial resistance, and that has just come out in 2016. Some of you from CDC, I'm sure you're very aware of this, but I'm going to mention things like that just to kind of give you an idea that this antimicrobial resistance discussion is really, I see it in the One Health Day events, I see it in student organizations having these conversations all around the world. So we're not alone, and it's pretty exciting to see it happening. How many of you are familiar with the book One Health and the Politics of Antimicrobial Resistance, written by my colleague Laura Kahn? She's done a fabulous job kind of, I think, taking a very even-handed approach, kind of getting us out of the finger-pointing that was going on for so long. And I just mentioned in that review that I just told you about that was commissioned in the United Kingdom, the numbers that came out of that were mind-boggling. I did not realize until I saw that review, actually this is an excerpt here, that we estimate 700,000 deaths a year now from antimicrobial resistant organisms. And that by 2050, when we think we might have 9 billion plus people on the earth, that if we continue on our current trajectory, we probably will be looking at 10 million people a year dying from an antimicrobial resistant organism. So what you guys are about here is a big deal. It's incredibly important that these conversations you're having here at this meeting really resonate for all of us. And that 10 million deaths would add up to about 100 trillion US dollars in loss in productivity. So this is a big deal. Back to Laura Kahn's book. I was really heartened yesterday to hear Laura talking about companion animals, because one of the things that Laura Kahn had spent 5 years researching her book, one of the takeaway messages that she found after looking at all the research was that one thing we're not looking at enough from a surveillance perspective and just factoring it into our antimicrobial resistant conversations was antimicrobial resistant organisms in pets and companion animals. So it's really nice to see that we're starting to look at some of that data. We don't know where it's coming from. Is it coming from people to the pets? So the genomics of that work is going to be incredibly important. In fact, it's important for all of our discussions about antimicrobial resistance. The other really important point for my mind that came out of some of her research was what I think is we're just beginning to wrap our brains around the whole environmental impact and environmental aspects of antimicrobial resistant organisms. We now know that it's in our soils. It affects the plant microbiome, the microbiota, the root system of the plants. We know that these antimicrobial resistant organisms can get into the plants, can actually be exposed to people that way. I want to, if I could, just challenge the NIAA. What do we feed our poultry and our cows? We feed them plants, right? We feed them corn and soybeans. In fact, I know there's a soybean organization supporting this conference. Where are the plant people at this meeting if we're having an antibiotic discussion? So let's try to get the plant people involved, because the horticulturalists are also incredibly involved in determining how we're going to feed 9 billion people in the future from both plant and animal-based proteins. So we know that these antimicrobial resistant organisms are impacting the soil. There's actually a soil health institute that's just started up in North Carolina that I've also been talking to about this One Health concept, but it's emerging information that the soil microbiota is as important as our gut microbiota. And our gut microflora, we all know that is incredibly important for our immune system function and our overall health. So these are just things that we're not thinking about yet. If you'll allow me to bring them forward and say, challenge us to include these thought processes in our discussions. It was actually pretty exciting to me. I found a website on Penn State's, one of their web pages, that Soil Health for One Health. So when I see soil being tied to One Health and animal health being tied to One Health, I get pretty excited to see those conversations. There's actually a soils and human health book that's been written. So a little bit outside what you have been talking about at this meeting. We're also seeing antimicrobial resistant organisms in marine mammals in the middle of the ocean. They've never been given antibiotics. How are they getting these resistant organisms? Well, it turns out a lot of our waterways that are washing into our oceans are receiving a lot of what we're putting into the environment, be it from excess feeds or the feces from the animals we feed it to, or the urine and feces from the people that take antibiotics. One of the things that Laura pointed out when she was writing this book was that some of the countries, and you are all very aware of this, I'm sure, some of the countries that allow over-the-counter sale of antibiotics at any corner store with no medical oversight are the same countries that still culturally prefer open defecation. So you've got populations that are taking antimicrobials with no medical oversight, putting that material into the environment that's being washed into our waterways and ending up in the ocean. So that the ocean is really becoming a reservoir for the exchange of these resistomes, or these segments on the DNA of the bacteria that are of the resistant genes. And I'm certainly not an expert in that area, but it makes perfect sense to me that might be an explanation for why we're seeing antimicrobial resistant organisms in our marine mammals. But there are some other thoughts. I used to work for a poultry company when I was right out of college, before I went to vet school. And one of the things I did was I analyzed feeds and feed ingredients for what would go into that poultry company's vertically integrated system, right? Did you realize that the fish farms where a lot of our fish meal that goes into these feeds comes from are using antibiotics? And I've just become recently aware that under these fish ponds, that the residue from those antimicrobials are in our oceans there too. So I guess my point here is that we've released the dragon from the box. It's going to be really hard to put it back in, because now it's in our environment. And we're going to have to really, really figure out how to address this, even beyond what the fabulous conversations that are having here. This is a very big picture challenge here for us. And I was blown away just a year or so ago. I realized, I didn't know this, I'm a veterinarian, I have a PhD in endocrine physiology. I had no clue that plant producers, that citrus growers use antibiotics in their crops. And there's a whole other area that we're not thinking about, communicating information. And I don't know how it's regulated. I don't know if they have a veterinary feed directive for using their crops. I do know that apiaries, this is something that many of us are not aware of, that with the new veterinary feed directive, there are bee growers, apiarists, whatever the word is, who do also use antibiotics in their beehives. And now we're having to train up veterinarians to know how to interact with these bee producers, because we're not trained that in veterinary school, so that we can write a veterinary feed directive for them to use the product in their beehives. So these are things that we're not thinking and talking about very often. Our pollinators globally are really, really in trouble. In some countries, they're having to hand pollinate crops, if you can imagine that. In this country, you can rent beehives, and some of you will know this better than me. You can rent beehives to come and service your crop because there aren't enough bees left in our natural environment. So this interconnectedness here is mind-boggling as to how we really need to step back and look at the really big picture. So for some of these new thought processes. I love to use this slide. It's just a reminder of where our populations are around the world and how we're going to feed ourselves without continuing to destroy our environment or contaminate our environment, how we're going to provide enough protein to really feed this. I hope that eventually we're not fighting wars over water security. And then this one, I hope you can see this. It looks like it's down close at the bottom of the slide. Food insecurity in some countries can be a source of a security challenge, a global security challenge. So I like to tell people when we're talking about many of these One Health issues, we're not just talking about our security, we're not just talking about zoonotic diseases, we're not just talking about antimicrobial resistance. We're having a much larger conversation about global security in some of the countries that can be, totally unstabilized by horrible zoonotic diseases like Ebola or by food insecurity. In fact, I just last night dug this out. I wanted to see if I could figure out where the greatest hunger crisis is right now in the world. And it looks like Central African Republic and Sudan. I'm sure you guys have been following the news, and you know some of the civil wars and the civil strife that's going on there and how they've not been able to keep their crops going. So I challenge you to think sometimes. I know we all have to focus on our everyday jobs and what we're trying to accomplish, and what your guys are working on is very needed and exciting, but also occasionally step back and look at the really, really big picture. So on the international front, I hope we're going to hear a little bit more about some of the country level things that are going on from Dr. Petra, but it's been mentioned, the OIE and the FAO and the WHO a few times during this meeting. I just would like you to be aware that they refer to themselves as the One Health tripartite. Back in 2010, they signed an agreement to work together because, as you know, WHO focuses on human health, FAO focuses on food health, and OIE is the World Animal Health Organization. So they have pledged to work together. Now, that's a lot easier said than done sometimes. So the images here are the three current directors of the OIE, FAO, and WHO, and they have a tremendous partnership going to address antimicrobial resistance at the global level. So I urge you just Google One Health Tripartite or OIE antimicrobial resistance, and you'll get on a long kind of continued investigation that you can see yourself of what's going on at the global level, being led by those global organizations. So I'd like to also mention, since I'm just really making us think outside the box here, I'd like to mention some of the alternative things, and hopefully maybe Dr. Petra will mention some of these. Bacteriophage therapy. I don't know if you're aware that the bacteriophages were discovered like in the 1914, and there was some investigation going up and through the 40s, and then antibiotics hit the scene, right? And all the attention was turned to antibiotics, and all the phage therapy research was just kind of stopped. And now there are some people who are starting to return to that thought and see if there are ways that we could use that now to help us in our antimicrobial resistance crisis. But other things are, we've had vaccines mentioned here numerous times. That's extremely exciting. Seemed like there was one other on this slide, but maybe not. And then I'll just mention a company that I know called AEQUOR, AEQUOR, that is working on ways to disrupt biofilm formation, because for any organism to establish an infection, many of them, first establish a biofilm. And if you can disrupt that biofilm, you have a foothold to kind of prevent the need for an antibiotic. So I just say watch this space, because these are some things that I think might provide some pretty exciting things for us in the future. Here's another mind tickler. I did not realize until I was contacted by Tom Shryak a couple of years ago. This blew my mind. Maybe you guys know this already, but I didn't. Do you know that the protocols used for testing for antimicrobial resistant organisms are different across countries? We're not using a standardized procedure. So if we're talking antimicrobial resistant organisms, we might be comparing apples to oranges because they're not necessarily using the same augers or incubation times or the same protocols at all. So the Clinical and Laboratory Standards Institute is trying to urge a conversation to get us all on the same page and using the same protocols across the globe, so that we can at least evaluate our situation on a more apples to apples and oranges to oranges method. I just mentioned this because a lot of people are not familiar with PATRIC, the Bacterial Bioinformatics Resource Center, trying to make resources available for researchers. Any of you know about PATRIC already? So I'm sure those of you in the government. So just check it out if you're interested, if you're a researcher especially. And one more real quick out-of-the-box thing, and then I need to be quiet. There's a company in North Carolina that calls itself Integrated Biochem. And they have been working for a number of years, and I think this started in somebody's garage. They've basically created a giant metal rumen where organic waste can be put in and digested, and then they're able to harvest from that digestion enzymes that can be fed back into the pharma industry and all sorts of places. I think this is they could change the world. In fact, I got so excited about it, I met with the gentleman who is heading this. His name is Ed Kalt, and they call it Managed Ecosystem Fermentation. I told him, Ed, if you can make this happen, you can change the world. Think of all the poultry litter and the swine waste and the things that we really struggle with. And for example, in North Carolina, what do we do with all those carcasses from the poultry facilities that got flooded with Florence? I mean, they're just piled high with dead chickens and the swine ones, the dead pigs. So this could be a real game changer if something like this could actually become a reality. I was terribly disappointed though recently because I specifically asked him, Ed, can you do this with swine waste? And they've tried, and evidently there's not enough organic material in the swine waste to make it work. But the poultry litter and the refuse from poultry processing could definitely go in. And they're also trying to harvest food left over from hotels and try to basically recycle that food. Thank you. So we've mentioned this a number of times, that the collaborations we need are going to start with relationships, and you guys are doing that right here now in this room. So I want to congratulate you on that and challenge you to keep it up.